Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Chetna Cates, and I am the Director of Membership at the Baker Institute. I'll start with a quick introduction of Dr. Jones, and we'll take your questions after his talk. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and not the chat button when you send me the questions, please. Dr. Mark Jones is the Fellow in Political Science at the Baker Institute, the Joseph D. Jamal Chair in Latin American Studies, and a professor in the Department of Political Science at Rice University. Dr. Jones?
Okay. Hello, everybody. Can everybody hear me? Chetna, give me a cue if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And I'm going to try to talk about some things related to both the 2020 elections and then where COVID-19 fits into this whole process. And so I'm going to start off by sort of laying the ground for what things look like in terms of the state of play as we approach November. So I think one thing that's very interesting with the Texas elections, and when this is the US House, is if we went back to as recently as 2016, and I was showing you a similar chart right here, you would just see one election. You'd see Texas 23, now it's open, but you'd see Texas 23 in the toss-up category, and then the rest would be blank, because the other 35 US House seats at the time were not competitive. But 2016 happened with the election of President Trump in 2018. And so now we're in a situation as we roll into 2020 where there are 9 US House seats, that's 1 in 4 of our US House seats, that are legitimately in play. We have the 2 Democratic seats, Lizzie Fletcher's in Texas 7 here in the Houston area, and Colin Allred in Texas 32 up in Dallas in sort of the Turtle Creek area, where they won those seats back in 2018 with Fletcher defeating incumbent Congressman John Culberson and Allred defeating incumbent Congressman Pete Sessions. Those 2 are the only Democrats who are remotely vulnerable. And then we see have Hurd's seat. He's leaving and he's not seeking re-election. That seat's already in the lean Democratic column. We have 2 seats in the middle, Pete Olson's old seat, which is open down in Texas 22, Kenny Marchant's seat up in the Metroplex, 24 that's open. And then in the leaning GOP, we have Michael McCall in Texas 10, which stretches from western Harris County all the way up to Austin. Chip Roy's, which stretches from Austin all the way down to San Antonio. Those are 2 of the more gerrymandered districts we have. Not to be outdone, though, we also have Texas 2, which is a likely GOP seat, which is Dan Crenshaw's. While not covering as much terrain as not going into different cities, is pretty well gerrymandered here in the Houston metro area. And then to top it off, in the other lean GOP category, we have Congressman Carter's seat up in Texas 31, which is Williamson County primarily. So these are sort of where things face up as we move to the fall. Lizzie Fletcher is facing Wesley Hunt, who won his primary. In 23, Gina Ortiz-Jones will face the winner between Tony Gonzalez and Raul Reyes, who are competing in the Republican runoff in July. Ortiz-Jones is heavily favored there. Lizzie Fletcher's pretty favored in Texas 7, although she's probably the most vulnerable Democrat, although still not all that vulnerable. Colin Allred's facing Genevieve Collins up in Texas 32. In Texas 22, that's here in the Houston area. It's Fort Bend County, as well as part of Brazoria County, the northern part, and then a sliver of Harris County. Sheree Kulkarni, who competed against Pete Olson back in 2018, is running again as the Democratic nominee. And he'll face either Troy Nails, the Fort Bend County Sheriff, or Kathleen Wall, who ran unsuccessfully in 2018 for the Republican nomination in Congressional District 2. This is a district that if Nails wins it, it's probably going to move into the lean Republican category, whereas if Kathleen Wall wins it, it's likely to move into the lean Democratic category, in spite of the fact that she's once again spending multiple millions of her own resources. She's the least electable candidate that the Republican Party has. Up in 24, Beth Van Dyne's a pretty strong candidate to keep Texas 24 in Republican hands. She'll face either Kim Olson or Candace Valenzuela. In the lean Republican districts, we have Michael McCall, that's District 10, facing one of 2 Democrats, Siegel or Pratish Gandhi. Pradesh Gandhi. Wendy Davis, the 2014 Democratic gubernatorial nominee who suffered a shellacking at the hands of Greg Abbott by about 20%, is facing Chip Roy, who's a relatively uninspiring Republican candidate who's potentially vulnerable. John Carter's facing another challenge, although the Democrats didn't get their favorite candidate. She finished third in the primary, so it's going to be Christine Eddie Mann or Donna Emmon against Carter. And then 2 seats where the Republican is likely to win. That's District 2, where I'm sitting right now on the Rice campus. Dan Crenshaw is facing Sima Latjabarian. And then in the Senate race, whoever wins in the July runoff, MJ Hager or Royce West, will go on to face John Cornyn, who they'll likely lose to. So one thing that really is important when we think about the upcoming race and this upcoming legislative season is the issue of redistricting in 2021. That is, every 10 years, we get new census data, and those data are used to create new US House districts, new Texas House districts, and new Texas Senate districts. Now, there are a couple of things that we know for certain about the state of play in the Texas legislature during the 2021 session. It starts in January, ends in May. Although it's increasingly likely that they're going to have to call a special session for redistricting if the redistricting data are late. But we know that Greg Abbott will continue to be governor and that there will be a GOP majority in the Senate. It may be 1813, it may be 1714, but Dan Patrick and Texas Republicans will call the shot there. Thus, if Texas Democrats are going to have a seat at the redistricting table, their only real option is the Texas House, where right now Republicans have an 83 to 67 majority, meaning that Democrats need a net gain of 9 seats to take control of the Texas House. Now that's important for 2 reasons. The first is that for the US House redistricting, if Republicans have control of the House, the Senate, and the governorship, we'll see likely another extreme partisan gerrymander where Republicans will legally and constitutionally use their majority power to craft districts, 38 or 39 for the US House, depending on how many seats we get, to essentially benefit the Republican Party and hurt the Democratic Party. And that's especially important for national Republicans and national Democrats because Texas provides far and away the largest GOP state delegation in the country. It's 23 right now. The next largest is Florida, and that's likely to shrink. After that, we don't have any other state that's even in the double digits. So if Republicans are going to ever get their majority status back in the US House, and if Democrats are going to keep Republicans from getting their majority back, a lot of it hinges on who controls redistricting in 2021 in the Lone Star State. So that's a major fight. Now, for the other districts, for instance, Texas Senate and Texas House, those districts are less affected by Democratic control of the speakership because if there's a disagreement between the House and the Senate, then the plan would go to the Legislative Redistricting Board, where the Republicans would have a 4-to-1 majority and be able to pass whatever plan they wanted. Now, that all said, whatever plan emerges out of the Legislative Redistricting Board, that would be challenged in the courts by Democrats. And if they had a plan that actually passed out of the Texas House, that would have a little stronger legal standing than just a minority report that they would put up forward. So there's a lot at stake in terms of control of the Texas House, and that's why we're seeing such national interest. We already saw it in a special election down in Fort Bend County, where millions of dollars were spent. Michael Bloomberg, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Beto O'Rourke all got involved. And the reason is because a lot of national politics and the control of the U.S. House will depend in part on what happens in Texas House races in November of 2020. So when we think of these races, it's important to keep in mind we have this idea that the Democrats, if they're going to take control of the House, need a net gain of 9 seats or 8 seats to tie. Right now, if you look at the state of play, there are 64 safe Republican seats, 55 safe Democratic seats, and Democrats, you see some that are pretty easy to pick off, such as Morgan Meyer up in Dallas. Morgan Meyer up in Dallas. That's one that Democrats could have a good chance to pick off. And then there's an open seat in Fort Bend, 26, a seat up in Collin County, Dallas County, and an open seat in Harris County where Democrats have a good chance to pick up at least 5 seats there. They do have to defend Michelle Beckley's seat up in Denton County and Gina Kalani's in Harris County that are vulnerable. But if Texas Democrats are going to take control of the Texas House, they're going to need to win a substantial number in this lean Republican category, probably at least 4 or 5, assuming they can hold on to all of these, Beckley's and Kalani. So like then here, Sarah Davis's, which is also where I'm sitting right now at Rise. But then also we have Tarrant County, a couple in Tarrant County that are open. Steve Allison's seat down in Bexar County, Mike Leach up in Collin County. And then potentially, you can't, if you're a Democrat, you just can't rely on this small choice set here because this is just 11 seats, which would mean we need to win 9 of 11 and not lose these 2. So you're going to see Democrats active trying to pick off at least a couple of these seats in the likely Republican column. And of course, all of this is just post-primary. Some of these things can change as we move closer towards November, working in Democrats' favor or in Republicans' favor. So the presidential election is now set. Now, had we not entered the COVID-19 pandemic, odds are Bernie Sanders would still be fighting with Joe Biden, and we'd be setting up for the Northeast primary on next Tuesday, where Bernie Sanders would be making his last stand. As reality, set in, Sanders dropped out, and now we have Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, and that's set. So if we're thinking about COVID-19 and how it's affected Donald Trump's reelection efforts, I think there are a couple ways to think about it. Now, the negative, and certainly I think this is the biggest negative for Trump, is that generally you have a lot of economic voters out there. They tend to vote, when they're not voting based on pure partisanship, they vote for the incumbent governor or the executive, in this case, the president, when the economy is booming, and they tend to punish the incumbent president when the economy is in the downturn. Arguably, we're going to be in the worst recession since really the worst economic situation in the country since the Great Depression. So that's a negative for Donald Trump, especially if he can't get us in a sort of V-type rebound where we hit rock bottom sometime in June or July and then start to go up in terms of economic growth as we approach November. So that's working against it. Now, what's working in favor of him is that he does have the opportunity to be more presidential. Donald Trump has been one of the least sort of presidential presidents we've had, in the sense that he's maintained the role of a very partisan, very divisive figure. And the crisis has allowed him to provide him with the potential platform to be more presidential. Sometimes he is more presidential, and then when he's calling for essentially, rising up against the governors of Michigan, Minnesota, and Virginia, he's not being very presidential. So right now, if you look at the next 2 items, it's really difficult to know how the things are going to go. Donald Trump has a real advantage over Joe Biden right now in that he's on national TV every day in the Oval Office, appearing very presidential. Biden is much less frequently on national TV and is essentially broadcasting, sheltering in place from his basement. Now that can benefit Trump if he uses it effectively, and it can hurt him if he uses it ineffectively. Likewise for Biden, the negative is that he's not out there, not essentially in the public eye the same way as Trump is. But given Biden's frequent use of frequent gaffes, misstatements, and sometimes questions regarding his memory and whether he's really fit to be president, maybe being in the basement isn't the worst thing in the world. And then finally, a lot will depend on how the country emerges from the pandemic, or at least this first phase of the pandemic as we approach the election. The better we emerge, and the more Trump will be given credit for it, even if he doesn't deserve it. And the worse we are, the more Trump will be essentially punished, even if he doesn't deserve it. So right now, the impact of it, we're still too far out to really know. You can't really start to think about the true vote choice in the presidential election outside of a pure partisan vote until at least till we hit August or September. Now, one thing that is notable is that the light green line here is President Trump's approval rating. This is from Gallup, and the dark line is his disapproval rating. You saw that with the rise of the pandemic, he did hit some of his highest approval ratings in quite some time. Getting right at about 50%. And for a very brief period, his approval ratings were slightly larger than his disapproval ratings. Then, of course, Donald Trump being Donald Trump, he let that sort of slip away. And now we're starting to move back to his normal pattern where his approval ratings are in the low 40s. He virtually never goes below 40 or much below it. And his disapproval ratings are in the low 50s. Now, this is what we often call in political science the rally around the flag effect, the tendency to essentially support your president in times of crisis. What we see, though, is this is a pretty marginal effect to the extent to which it occurred at all. I'll give you an example from another country. This is from Argentina, where President Alberto Fernandez with the blue had sort of positive ratings that when he started out in his administration in late December were in the mid 40s, and it dropped to the high 30s right before he began to adopt quarantine measures. You can see since the quarantine measures went into effect, he effectively transitioned from being a partisan president to sort of head of government to a head of state, a president of all Argentines, and his approval ratings are now right up at about 70%. So when you think about rally around the flag effect, such as we saw with George W. Bush after 9/11, this is really more what you'd see in a society that wasn't as polarized, where more than 2/3 of the population is rallying behind their president. We're not seeing that in the United States. Our bump for President Trump is at most 2 or 3 points. So as we look ahead to the upcoming election, this would be a state of play as we sort of think about the Electoral College. Remember, of course, that in the United States, it's an anachronism. We're still the only we're now the only democracy in the world that still uses this Electoral College rather than a direct vote to elect their president. But the reality is those are the rules of the game. And just as in football, you don't win by having more time of possession, but rather by having more points. In the Electoral College, you don't win by having more votes, rather by having more seats in the Electoral College. And here, the beige are toss-up states. The reddish colors, the lightest pink is lean Republican. The next shade of Republican red is likely Republican, and the dark red is solid, sure thing Republican. And then it's the reverse for the Democrats. So like dark blue, California and New York are locks for Democrats. Sort of medium blues, Colorado and New Mexico are likely Democratic. And then the only real toss-up states that the only real lean Democratic states are Minnesota and New Hampshire. Now, as this sort of map says, there's a strong advantage for Joe Biden as he starts out. The number of states, the number of Electoral College seats he needs to win are much lower, but it does suggest that the election is going to be fought primarily in the upper Midwest, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and then to a lesser extent, Florida. And those will be sort of the races that really decide who the next president of the United States is. And for President Trump, he really needs to sweep or at least win 2 out of 3 of the toss-up states in the upper Midwest and win Florida as well if he's going to have a hope of being reelected. So if we're thinking about the US House of Representatives, there's no question really that the US House will remain in Democratic control. Right now there's a 234 to 200 Democratic advantage. If you sort of play it out, the most likely scenario is Democrats end up with somewhere between 225 and 245, at least today, and Republicans are between 190 and 210. But in no case do Democrats drop below the 218 seats that they would need to have an absolute majority. So I don't think there's any doubt Democrats will continue to control the US House. Where the doubt remains, though, is more in the Senate. Here we have currently a 53 to 47 Republican advantage. But as you'll see up here, you have far more vulnerable vulnerable Democrats than you do Republicans. The only really vulnerable Democrat is Doug Jones, who won just because of the Republicans' nomination of a truly dreadful candidate in Alabama, which is a dark red state. And I think to really know all you needed to know about Donald Trump and Alabama, you just need to watch the Alabama football game where Donald Trump and Melania Trump appeared, and he received a standing ovation. That tells you that I think in Alabama, unless the Republicans screw up again in terms of their candidate, that seat will flip, which means that for Democrats to at least tie, and assuming that we have a Democratic president, then to be the tiebreaker, or in the case that Donald Trump's reelected, picking up 4. There's some seats like Cory Gardner's out in Colorado, or Martha McSally, Susan Collins, and Tom Tillis, which are toss-up seats. There's a reasonable chance to win. But even if Democrats win those, the best they could hope for is a tie, assuming Doug Jones loses. So they probably need to knock off Joni Ernst, the open seat in Kansas, or Steve Daines. Now, for those of us in Texas, there's a reason why John Cornyn is likely Republican. One is he's a better candidate than, say, Ted Cruz, and neither MJ Hager or Rodney Ellis are going to be Beto O'Rourke. But another is that we're unlikely to see much in the way of national Democratic money filter down. And one reason to think about that is we have about 29 million people here in Texas. if you're a Democrat, you can campaign here in Texas to try to defeat John Cornyn, who's a strong favorite, or for about the same amount of money, you can campaign in Arizona, Colorado, Maine, Alabama, Iowa, Kansas, and Montana, which have a smaller number of people and don't have the expensive media markets we have. Number 5, Dallas-Fort Worth. Number 7, Houston. 31, San Antonio. 40, Austin. And then 16 other markets if you want to cover the entire state. So Texas is a very expensive state, and so you're unlikely to see Democrats spend much money to knock off Cornyn. They get better value for their buys in places like Arizona, Maine, North Carolina, Colorado, and Iowa, for instance. So one thing that's going to come up right now, and this is a topic that is both relevant for the July primaries, although it's probably too late to do anything for that, and then particularly for November, is what to do about mail ballots. So right now, our mail ballot process is you need to print out a form, sign it, and submit it by mail to your county clerk. You can either do an annual application where you check that you want to be sent a mail ballot for every election during the year, or you can do it election by election. So if you applied for a mail ballot for the primaries, you'll get sent one for the rest of the year. Now, if you're just doing an application, you would need to send it to the secretary to the county clerk. And in the case of the primaries that are coming up in July, assuming they're held on that date, you would need to get them to the county clerk by no later than July 2nd. Then once you have your mail ballot, you would need to mail it back to the county clerk, and it would have to arrive by election day, unless you're mailing it from overseas, in which case you get 5 days, or if you have a military ballot, in which you get 6 days after the election. Then what happens is you have a small group that gets together in the election offices, and they review the signatures based on what you have on file to what's on the ballot, and they decide if it matches or not. Now, Texas doesn't have any real rules for how that's done. It's done sort of eyeballing. And so you do run the risk when you do a mail ballot that they reject your signature and you essentially have no recourse. That is, if they reject it, it's rejected. So that is one downside to always using a mail ballot, is you can't be 100% certain that your ballot will actually be accepted. So for the July primary runoffs, election day is July 14th, assuming that those are still held then. Early voting would be July 6th through 10th. And right now we have our traditional vote by mail rules, whereby those 65 and older can vote, no excuse, they can just do it. Then other people who, if you're sick or hospitalized or you're in jail but are still eligible to vote, you can also request it. Now, Democrats have been advocating for a interpretation of the mail ballot legislation such that if you are afraid of catching the COVID virus, that you can effectively, that fear is essentially the equivalent of being sick, and therefore that anyone who has that fear can request a mail ballot. If it's unclear if that's going to make it to the courts, Republicans such as Ken Paxton are challenging that, our Attorney General. Republicans generally want to go by the standard rules. But even if you are going to do that, you would have to send your ballot in by June 29th or 30th. So, this is how, sort of for November, it's the same idea. You could do the current normal methods or those that have been proposed, anyone fearful of COVID-19. So there's some logistics that are involved in all of this. And one of the real problems is that this is very labor intensive. So Harris County, we have the highest use of mail ballots in the state, in part because both local Republican groups as well as Democratic groups, activist groups, do a pretty strong job or are very active in terms of trying to get people to apply for mail ballots and doing a lot of the applications for them. But that's still only, we're at 7%, 7.6%. That's 101,594 mail ballots out of 1.3 million. What would have to happen is if we were going to adopt mail ballots on a much broader scale for November, we need to really make that decision sooner rather than later. And by sooner, I mean sometime in the next month or two, because all of the county clerks are going to have to staff up, both in terms of people, as well as develop procedures in terms of logistics, especially if we still need to do social distancing, such that they can receive these applications. Once they receive them, process them, then mail the ballots out, receive the ballots back, review the ballots and count them in a timely manner. So we're not like California, for instance, and sometimes with some of their mail ballots where they're still counting for weeks after the election, although their mail ballots can, as long as they're postmarked by election day and arrive in a reasonable period, are counted. Now, one critique of mail ballots is that it is more susceptible to fraud, and that's true. That is, compared to voting in person, you always are going to get a little more potential for fraud in mail ballots because signatures, validations, there is no real process, and so if it's close, they often take it. It's very easy to engage in vote harvesting, particularly in retirement communities and some types of facilities. You often can, it's easier if you have mail ballots for people to be registered multiple times and vote multiple times. And then you often have the issues of patriarchal or other control situations where someone's spouse or parent or grandparent effectively determines how they vote, and that person is not given any say. Now, all of that is very minor. It's not really a practical concern in that it's unlikely to affect the outcome of any election. It'd be more philosophical. Are you willing to trade a tiny bit of fraud for a greater level of participation? So while it's incorrect to say, I think, that massive fraud would occur, it's also incorrect to say that absolutely no fraud will occur. Is the fraud relevant? Probably not, or salient? Probably not. But fraud will occur because fraud is very easy with mail ballots. There's a reason why, say, in Latin America, another area where I work, and where election fraud is a major concern, none of those countries use anything approaching mail ballots because of the ease that it would be to engage in fraud with those mail ballots. So I'm going to stop there. Let's see, and see, I guess, take any questions.
Okay, we have a couple of questions just because this is where you stopped about mail ballots. Somebody asks, who decides if, that this is going to be done by a mail ballot or not? Is it going to be the current administration that's going to make the decision, or how is the decision going to be made?
Well, there are a couple ways to think about it. One is that Governor Abbott has emergency powers that I don't think he could push. I think that what the Democrats are trying to do is probably the easiest thing to do legally without calling the legislature back in session, and that is interpreting the spirit of the current statute such that, because if you're sick or disabled, or the idea is if illness or some type of sort of affliction prevents you from voting, that's a legitimate reason to vote by mail. And so you could make the argument that the fear of catching the virus is sufficient to allow you to vote by mail. That fits under the broader spirit of the legislation. Now, a lot depends. If Attorney General Ken Paxton opposes it, though, and the Republican-controlled, it's the all-Republican Supreme Court rules in that favor, then it's not possible. The only way to do it would be by calling the legislature back in session. So a lot depends on whether Republicans are open to doing mail balloting or not. What I don't think we're going to see, and what you would need calling the legislature back into session, would be going to an all-mail ballot system whereby everyone receives a ballot.
Also, another quick question about mail-in ballots. Somebody notes that they have been informed that those are much more expensive than polling stations, that it costs $35 per ballot. Is that correct?
No, I mean, it shouldn't cost 30. I'm trying. I don't know the exact cost of it. It is more expensive in the sense that you need more people. You actually have to have people involved, because you do have to have somebody, you have to pay somebody to receive the application, open it up, verify it, and then find that person's separate application, because everybody's application is distinct. So then they have to print out an application that fits that exact person. I don't know if it'd be $35, but it is more expensive, simply because it's a process by which you have to have people physically doing all of that work. 35 seems high to me, but I don't know the exact cost.
And then we also have a couple of questions about the overall elections due to the current situations? Is it a possibility that elections might be postponed, or somebody asks if it might be completely suspended?
I mean, that's always a fear, and it's something you wouldn't want to rule out. But I think that would take that we would have to be in a much worse situation than we are right now for that to occur, because so much depends on all of our especially we're talking about a presidential election here. We effectively did that with our local elections when Governor Abbott, for the small numbers of municipalities and school districts that were supposed to have May elections, those were postponed until November. What effectively was done there was those elections wait till November, and even though the terms are up this summer, people will just continue to fill those positions until such time that their successors are elected in November. And that's one thing to do that for a school board or for a small city council. It's another thing to do that for President of the United States and the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House. So I think there would be extreme resistance to any possibility of doing that. Although if the pandemic became really bad in October, November, and if the country was not set up for mail balloting, postponement might be the only option, although I think it would be a last resort. And that's one of the reasons why it might be quite prudent to at least invest the money, where the federal government is effectively, in some ways, sort of throwing money all over the place. That is, many of these $1 trillion, all they're doing is really buying time. That it's keeping people employed to June 30th, but then July 1st, a lot of these companies are going to lay all these people off because they just have to keep them employed until June 30th. It might be prudent by the federal government, and I think a lot of Democrats are pushing for this, is to at least provide the money to the counties and the states such that they can create a system such that for mail balloting, they can put infrastructure in place that if they need to pull the trigger on that, it's in place. Because as I mentioned before, you can't just go to mail ballot. You can't make a decision October 1st, we're going to go to mail balloting. That would be a nightmare because logistically we're not set up for it. You have to start planning now, and it would be prudent to spend $400 or $500 million, or 300 million, whatever the amount might be, to get set up for that, such that if it does occur, we can pull the elections off.
We have a lot of questions on mail ballots still. People are wondering if there could possibly be a national solution instead of it being left up to the states.
The United States is anachronistic on many things, and one place where we are actually quite anachronistic is we have delegated the management of our elections to our states. There are federal rules, but by and large, how those elections are run under the guidance of the states. Theoretically, yeah, you could see it could be possible to do that, but it's one thing to mandate it. But if you're not also including the money to do it, and that's effectively what the Democrats are trying to argue in Congress is provide the funds so that the counties and the states can ramp up to be ready to do mail balloting if need be. But the call would then still be on the cities and the counties, or the counties and the states. And I don't think the federal government would probably intervene there, and it'd be questionable if it has the ability to.
Okay, and what about any possibility of any kind of internet voting?
No, internet voting we're still a ways away from, in part due to the fear. I mean, if fraud is possible with mail ballots, it's even more possible with internet ballots, especially since we're not set up for it. And keep in mind, next time you go vote in say Harris County, the machine you're using is from the 1990s. And so, I mean, it's just, that's the other thing. There's the theoretical possibility of voting by mail, and then there's the reality that the computer systems that most of our counties, which handle this voting, which handle all of the voting, the systems they're using are from the 90s, or they're not up to the level of sophistication. And if you wanted to create a potential for Russian hackers or Chinese hackers to disrupt the democratic process, which they have an incentive to do in the sense that the more conflict and dissent we have in the United States, the better it is for China and Russia. Doing internet voting, even if it was done perfectly and correctly, the suspicion of whoever lost that they were robbed by fraudulent internet voting would be so high that that could cause some real problems for whatever administration would take office. So we're still far away. We don't even have online voter registration in many states, although that would be something that we should definitely be looking at in the midst of this pandemic.
Okay, that actually addressed one of the questions that we had about how could people register to vote in light of social distancing and the current situation. So you addressed that. But we have another question regarding, you mentioned hacking. So people are wondering, are either of the parties very serious about cybersecurity or whatever needs to be done to prevent any kind of hacking? Or is hacking such a small issue that nobody is really making huge investments into looking into that?
Well, by and large, most of the election systems we use are sufficiently offline, and the election authority, I mean, they're antiquated systems, but one way they've dealt with that is they made sure that they have no access to the internet. So to the extent to which they keep their systems walled off from the rest of the world, it still works reasonably well. Now, that's not to say that it is a potential problem, but that's where you get back to this logistical issue. You're not dealing with one national government agency, Federal Elections Commission, managing everything. You're dealing with counties with varying sophistication managing things. And so it's very difficult to implement a one-size-fits-all strategy across the board, because you have counties like Harris County or Dallas County, which are large, wealthy counties that have a lot of resources and a lot of technical know-how. You get out in some of these smaller counties, Arath County, Loving County, Andrews, where the county election official is like one person, and the computer they're using is using Windows 95 still. So there's those types of situations where a lot of these systems that might work with one system in one county don't work in another.
Okay, and we have a couple of questions about, I'm shifting gear here a little bit, but quite a few questions about do you have any input on who Joe Biden might pick as his running mate, and how would that affect the outcome?
Well, I think first, it'll be symbolic more than anything else. So most of the evidence we have suggests that the vice president doesn't help you win much in the way of doesn't help you much electorally. People are voting for the president. Symbolically, I think one thing is clear. We know Joe Biden will not be choosing an Anglo male as his vice presidential candidate. And almost certainly he'll be choosing a woman as his vice presidential candidate. That then leaves us, is it going to be a woman of color or an Anglo woman? But then within that realm, a lot of it just will have to do with fit, in addition to whether they fit the profile. So the first category will be they need to fit the profile that he's looking for. And then the second will be, is it someone that he's comfortable with, comfortable campaigning with, comfortable interacting with? I think a lot of people go back to the mistake John McCain made with Sarah Palin, where she did fit the suit. That is, she was what they were looking for, but the content was a disaster. And then she also just didn't click very well with Senator McCain. But right now it's far too early to really have an understanding of who it would be. And a lot of it will probably be to try to shore up whatever Biden's weaknesses are, depending whether it's policy, whether it's age, whether it's in terms of demographics. But I think one thing we can certainly rule is that it will not be an Anglo male. And then it most probably will be a woman. Other than that, though, I wouldn't be in a position to venture any guesses right now.
Okay, and along the same lines, is there any likelihood that President Trump might choose somebody else aside from Mike Pence as his running mate?
It's President Trump, so it's tough to predict based on. You could see the logic in doing it, and if he does do it, though, it would be after the Democrats. Well, I'm not sure about that. He would probably at least want to wait and see where things go with Democrats. But I could see it occurring. But if it did occur, he would do it to be very symbolic. So he would, in terms of sort of who he's representing, trying to reach out. So the dark horse candidate a lot of people often point to is Nikki Haley, his UN ambassador and former governor of South Carolina. that would be sort of the more audacious move that we might see as a way for him to, if he feels that he really needs to do something to boost his candidacy against the Democrats as we approach November.
Talking about boosting President Trump's candidacy, he's still over 85% approval rate with Republican voters, correct?
Yeah, President Trump is one thing that's been relatively remarkable is his floor is he has a floor that's pretty high, and it's like 20 feet of granite. It's like almost impossible for him to go below about 38-39% of the public. Whatever he does, he has about, one way to think about it, it's about 2/5 of the voters are with Donald Trump, hell or high water. Doesn't matter what he does, they're going to stick with him.
So considering that fact, how likely is it that the independents might side with him this time, considering this administration's handling of the current pandemic?
Well, it's probably too early. I mean, the sort of groups that are up for grabs, there's sort of two ways to look at the election. There's that small group of independents, maybe 10 or 11%, as well as weak-leaning Republicans and weak-leaning Democrats. Those are the groups that you could potentially get to shift to your side. So he's trying to keep those weak-leaning Republicans in the fold, win some of the independents, and maybe get a few crossover Democrats. The other group thing so that's one way you win elections. The other is you get your base to turn out at a higher rate than the other base. I think a lot of Donald Trump's strategy, at least up until now, has been not to try to reach out to other groups. That is, he isn't trying to expand his base all that much. What he is trying to do is mobilize his base so that they turn out at a higher rate than Biden's base. That's I think his strategy. All campaigns do both of that. I think Trump is leaning a little more towards mobilization of his base versus trying to reach out to independent voters. And part, I think what the numbers show is that Donald Trump has a floor of around 40%, but he's also shown he has a ceiling that's in the high 40s. That is, it's a very small number of people. There are very, very small number of people out there who haven't made up their minds on Donald Trump.
Okay, we also have a question on campaign, the different ways that people are campaigning. This current circumstance, how is this going to change campaigning in the future? Well, right now and in the future.
Well, for some campaigns, they haven't been all that effective. So a lot of the Senate campaigns, a lot of the campaigns and the presidential campaigns, things that were done primarily via television, those will be less affected because you'll still use television, social media as a way to get to people. Where they will be affected is raising money is going to be tougher now, given the economic crisis. People have less money to give, and you're going to have to be very cautious as a campaign not to overspend, because that could be seen as insensitive to people who are suffering. People are suffering, and you're like, say, Kathleen Wall down in Fort Bend County, spending millions of dollars to win a Republican nomination. That it can boomerang on you as well. The groups that I think will be very negatively affected, though, are those that rely more on outreach, block walking, door hanging, and smaller sort of events, such as state house candidates and some really state house candidates and more local candidates, because none of those campaigns have the money to really advertise all that much. And so they actually do still use block walking, small scale events, meeting with voters as a way to reach out. They're probably going to have to rely on social media more than they have in the past, because that's the one relatively inexpensive way to reach people. So I think you're going to see those campaigns investing a lot more in their digital efforts, both in terms of having more volunteers who are active in digital campaigning, and then investing more in Facebook ads and Twitter ads and the like.
Okay, we're almost running out of time, so I want to ask two quick questions. One, we're going to bring it back to Texas. Somebody asks, can you please talk about the impact of COVID-19 on healthcare discussions in state races and the 2021 legislative session in Texas regarding budget, expanding coverage, etc.?
Well, yeah, initially there was quite a bit of that. I think initially it was helping to sort of talk about highlighting the problems Texas has because we haven't expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. But as it's morphed out, I think a lot of that discussion's gone by the wayside because it's become more an issue of broader public health and not so much of health insurance coverage by some individuals or not, because its effect is large. I think it will, though, bring up the sort of discussions of providing better coverage and broader coverage in the 2021 session. I don't know if we're still at the point, if we've reached the point yet where people are willing to broach the topic of adopting or essentially expanding the Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. But we're the last major state that's a holdout, so maybe we're far enough from President Obama so that sort of the taint of Obamacare in the eyes of Republicans, or at least whatever that you would call it, that's sort of dissipated, and so that they're willing to vote for it not as part of Obamacare, just as a public policy initiative that would help Texas.
Okay. And then we also have a couple of questions about the recent 2020 census. First, do you think that there were problems in collecting accurate data during the census period? And if so, what kind of impact will it have in the 2020 elections, as well as actually gerrymandering in Texas?
Yeah, well, the first question, the census is first relying on people responding online. And that will get us up to about 65, 70, 75%. But then they need to use actual canvassers. Historically, people who've gone out door to door knocking on doors. They can't do that right now. So the census is going to be delayed for a while. And they're probably not going to be able to get as accurate a count via the canvassing, at least unless things improve dramatically. So they're going to have to do what we often in statistics call interpolating. So if the idea there is, people in these two houses on this block have not answered, but I know more or less what the distribution, what people look like who live on that block in terms of race, ethnicity, age, gender, owning or not owning their house. So I essentially interpret the number of people who live in those unknown houses based on the data from the neighborhood. And it's a little more sophisticated than that, but I think we're going to rely a little more on that interpolation than we have in the past, which is unfortunate, but it's the only real option. The other thing is the 2020 census data are likely to be delayed, and that doesn't affect most states, but it does affect Texas because our legislative session is early from January to May, and because we only meet biennially in a regular session. When the census data arrive in, say, July of 2021 or August of 2021, the governor is going to have to call a special legislative session to draw the districts. That shouldn't be problematic, but it will mean that we have a virtually certain special session. Now, once that session occurs, a lot will depend on whether Texas Democrats control the Texas House or not. If the Texas House continues to be in Republican control, then we're likely to see the same type of extreme partisan gerrymandering that we saw back in 2011, where Republicans very legitimately, because they're just playing by the rules of the game, take advantage of their majority control to craft U.S. House seats, state House seats, and state Senate seats that benefit the Republican Party as much as possible. And with the only constraint really being not violating the Voting Rights Act.
Okay, we are actually out of time, but I just want to end with unfortunately, a morbid question. Okay. We have a question that says that there's been some talk of the pandemic is slowing down over the summer and then coming back with a vengeance over the fall. And if that's the case, how will that affect the elections? One, and two, an even more morbid question. Both of the candidates, as we see them right now, President Trump as well as Joe Biden, are at an age group where the current pandemic is quite scary for them. If something were to happen, what would happen basically if one of the candidates were to pass away, or both?
Well, it depends when it occurred, but if it occurs, if they're on the ballot, then you would essentially, it would be up to the party to replace them. So the power goes to their party to replace them. So that would be a severe legitimacy problem, but it would be up to the party to essentially replace the nominee.
Okay, Dr. Jones, thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, is it okay if they email you directly?
Yeah, that'd be fine. Yes.
Great. If anybody has any questions, please send your questions to BIP RSVP and we'll forward it over to Dr. Jones. Thank you so much.
Thank y'all. It's been great being with y'all.